starting with how business and IT interact around requirements. So first of all, here's the first bit of earth-shattering news. The business does not actually give us requirements. Okay? Why not? For the first part is business people are usually much better at coming up with workarounds. There's something that I want to do, something I'm trying to achieve. The software won't let me do it. They already problem solve in their head. They say, all right, well, if you give me another column and I can put this data in here and then I can sort by that column, then, and they're in essence doing design in their heads to figure out what is the best way, or the way that they think, that their problem can be solved. They present that to us as a requirement. They have no business doing design. I'm sorry. All right? We need to accept that, say, that's a workaround. Now, who is this person that is, this role that is interacting with them around that? It's a business analyst. Now, when I use the term business analyst, I don't mean the, let's call it the common person that we often see in these roles in organization. The type of person that you need in this role is the kind of person that can push back on business stakeholders and say, I can understand why that would be an approach that would work for you, but let's try a different model. And the business person would not say, shut up and build what I told you to. This person needs to have sufficient presence, history, gravitas, whatever you want to call it, sufficient political connections in the organization to be able to push back and say, not quite like that, not quite yet, let's have a conversation. The problem is, in most organizations, BAs are stenographers. They're, yes, okay, got it. All right, I'll tell the team. We don't need somebody to write down and pass along. This is an actual profession. One of their tools is rapid prototyping. Say, what other ways could we solve your problem? And let's try it this way, let's try it that way, using tools like Balsamiq or any other type of quick and dirty screen prototyping type of tool to figure out what is the actual problem. And eventually we want to get to the conclusion of, so you wish something could be better, cheaper, faster. Once we can understand the you want X, what this thing is to be better, cheaper, faster, that's the point in time that we can say, oh, now I understand why you want what you want. It's important to understand the why. Once we have the why, then still not a requirement. But at least we have an idea of how to go about finding a requirement. Next step, business analyst continues doing their type of work to figure out what is the right way in order to solve this. But there's another component that needs to come in, which is the architect role, or one of the important components of the architect role to the development process is estimating. Now, the problem with estimates is most people don't know how to do it. Everybody talks about estimates, but the better structure for estimates, down over here, right? An estimate is given a well-formed team of a certain size. Well-formed, meaning this is a group of people that have worked together in the past. Not a bunch of people that we just picked up off of the street and threw together and said, okay, this is the team, right? You need to have a team, not a collection of individuals that know how to work together of a certain size. Already at this point, most organizations can't do estimates because they don't operate under this assumption, given a team of a certain size, a well-formed team. Next, that is not working on anything else. Oh, that's just crazy talk. You couldn't possibly, people not work. Otherwise, the estimate is meaningless, right? Given a well-formed team not working on anything else, then we can start to have a conversation on how long this thing might possibly take. All right? Here comes the next bit. I am C% confident, meaning this is not a promise. I'm providing you with a level of confidence that it will take between T1 and T2. An estimate has a range and a degree of confidence. If you don't follow this model of estimates, you are not actually giving estimates. You are speaking, but you are not actually estimating. All right? Yes?
I feel now you have to provide 4 estimates for S, C, T1, and T2.
That's correct. That's our role as architects, is to fill in these elements of the estimate, is to say, what is the size of the well-formed team, all right? And dealing with the fact of, well, between T1 and T2, and what is my confidence level? So the smaller the piece of work, T1 and T2 will be closer together, and my degree of confidence will be higher, right?
I get that, but we are not able to provide 1 estimate, and your solution is to provide 4 estimates. Doesn't that make the problem harder?
So,
especially the probability one.
Right.
Skeptical of that.
Right. So these numbers don't have to be perfect. They're let's call it a communication tool for an interaction with business stakeholders. So for example, we provide an estimate where, again, we're looking for something to say, the business comes and says, well, how long would it take to do X, right? That's what we got from over here. This X thing should be better, cheaper, faster, all right? And then we look at that and we say, all right, given a well-formed team, and again, this is based on a sort of a gut experience. The difference is that if someone says, can you do it by the end of the year, there's the developer interprets that to mean, can I prove that it can't be done? Or is it possible to disprove that it can't be done by the end of the year? And unfortunately, I look at that and say, well, no, there actually is a non-zero probability that this might be done by the end of the year. So we say, yes, it's possible for it to be done by the end of the year. The business person hears that and says, oh, so you just promised to get it done by the end of the year. That is the problem. That is what we're trying to solve. So if the business person comes to me and says, so can it be done by the end of the year? I can say, I am 5% confident that given a well-formed team not working on anything else, that it will be done by the end of the year. Or between, let's say, middle December, middle January, all right? Now the business might say, 5%? You're saying it's almost impossible that it'll be done. Yeah, I'm 95% sure it won't be done by the end of the year. That's a better form of communication, right? The issue here is not that if we can't do 1 estimate now, let's do 4 estimates, but rather it's a tool for us to communicate and document the likelihood of a given outcome to allow business stakeholders to make better decisions. Now, sometimes they may give us feedback and say, well, that's too broad. If we come to them and say, well, I'm 90% confident that it's going to take between 1 year and 3 years, they're going to say, well, great, but that's not a useful estimate for me. Okay, great. Let me do a proof of concept. Give me a week. Give me some time to do some analysis, some implementation, some testing, some performance testing, whatever. And at the end of this proof of concept period, I'll give you a new estimate. So there's a negotiation that's happening here around the estimate, around proof of concepts as a risk reduction process to loop as the proof of concept gets bigger and bigger, so the business to say, look, I'm not going to give you another month to deal with this. Your estimate of saying you're 80% confident that it's going to take between 14 months and 16 months, I'll take that and we'll go with it. But again, the important thing are these 2 things. It's not this, though this is a good mechanism to drive why you should let us do all sorts of proof of concept type work. It's the given a well-formed team not working on anything else. All right? So if we can get the business to sign off on this, we've already done a lot. Okay? Yeah.
The well-formed team sounds a bit vague.
Mm-hmm.
Should you sort of include a specification of skill sets somehow, or should you have a certain team already in mind, or what's sort of behind the well-formed team?
So I don't want to say obviously yes, but there's a certain element. So talking to an organization a while back, the PowerBuilder.net type of organization, and now they want to rewrite everything as a service in the cloud. Like, guys, you're missing a lot of skills and knowledge in-house here. So yes, you do have a well-formed team, but you're right, the knowledge and skills component is something that also is important. And I said, look, you're going to need to hire a whole bunch of people, and there's going to be just sort of an upskilling period as your well-formed teams get to a position that they could possibly build something like this. But you're still going to need to hire a whole bunch of people that have done this before. So
size seems like, size was sort of the only factor
right,
here.
right. So the well-formed team and a team that has suitable knowledge and skills for the thing that we're dealing with, absolutely. Now, after going through all that, and again, you can elaborate on this more. I just want to get your head into the right space in terms of how IT and business should be communicating with each other. At the point in time when the business accepts an estimate, now you have a requirement. That doesn't mean that the requirement is fleshed out completely. It doesn't mean that the estimate is it will be ready by the end of the year. But you've gotten to the point where the business has an idea of the value that they're going to be getting from this thing and an idea of the cost that it's going to be taking them to actually have it done, where they can say, all right, it's worth it. Right? At that point in time, it's a requirement. Just one last piece. When they say, oh, okay, so it'll be done in 18 months, say, no, I didn't say that. I said, given a well-formed team not working on anything else, then that would take, I'm 80% confident that it's going to take 18 months or less. But the thing is, we already have accepted a whole bunch of other requirements that we've already committed to. So, based on the backlog of work that has already been accepted, your feature should be ready by sometime around the end of 2025. At which point the business will throw a fit and say, that's totally unacceptable. You say, great, because now I have somebody else for you to talk to. Say, no. You're going to have to reprioritize those requirements. You're going to have to figure out, if you want this thing earlier, what other things are you going to push later? Because ultimately, our assumption is, well-formed team not working on anything else. So if you want this thing done sooner, something else is going to have to give. And then that's the point in time where the business stops being a monolithic single unity voice. You just sort of throw the list of requirements on the table and say, okay, you guys prioritize in which order. And I know that the architects here will say, no, there are certain features that we should be building in front of others. Don't even worry about that. They'll be at each other's throats for weeks, deciding what comes first and what comes next. All right? So the project manager doesn't really need to decide what the new dates are, so much as to just get that input of, well, what is the actual priority of requirements? Okay? So the whole dependency between features, that tends to be of a slightly lesser concern towards what the ultimate schedule ends up being. Now you might be looking at this and saying, but that doesn't look agile. That sounds totally waterfall, where first you're doing requirements, and then you're doing analysis and design, and then you're doing scheduling. Where is the agile in this? So first and foremost, this is not meant to be agile in name. This is meant to look at the communication problems between IT stakeholders and business stakeholders, and to try to make those things more explicit and to provide tools and frameworks for joint decision making. That's where we start. All of this can happen in parallel to the development of all of the previously accepted requirements, right? This doesn't mean that the team is just sitting there idle waiting for this stuff to happen. We can continue doing work on the accepted schedule from before while all of this haggling is happening in the background. So it's not in conflict. It's not phase-gated in the sense that you don't do the work until ultimately the schedule gets accepted. All right? You have a question from before, Gunnar?
I was just wondering, like, because you were doing the estimate earlier, usually the biggest risk in the estimate is that the requirements are constantly changing. So you just do something and but because usually you just come into a deadline and then they just have to figure it out how to what they're going to have in it in the end.
Right.
Because because you said they don't even know what the requirement is, and then you give it to you.
Right.
You're estimating something and you kind of don't know what you're doing anyways.
Right. So as you're saying, if they don't know exactly what they want, then how exactly are we going to provide an estimate, right? Let alone a well-formed estimate like this. So part of the responsibility of the business analyst role in this process is to help create enough meat on the skeleton of requirements to say, okay, now that I understand what problem you're trying to solve, and I saw the workaround that you originally came up with, they create, if not one well-formed skeleton and sort of fleshed out model, they might create a couple, and to say, all right, are all three of these more or less going to solve your problem? All right? At that point, that feeds into the architect's work, where the architect might look at these things and say, well, that one would be much easier for us to implement versus this one. So I know it's presented here, and it's just from a visual perspective, as a handoff from the business analyst to the architect to the next and the next. But there's a lot more collaboration here between these roles together with the business, and that gets back to the whole proof of concept type stuff, to figure out what actually needs to be built and how it can be built and to estimate through that process. But in essence, this is happening as a parallel stream of, again, proof of concept-y type of work to help figure out what should we even be building in parallel to building the stuff that we already know that should be built. So there's no, again, there's no easy cookbook recipe of how do proper functioning business analysts work with proper functioning architects, work with proper functioning project managers. But it needs to be clear that these three roles need to collaborate with each other and with business stakeholders in advance of any requirement being accepted to the team. And that work, in essence, is feeding into that final schedule, that final definition of, oh, okay, this is what we're doing, this is roughly how we're going to be doing it. And that's why, coming back to this, we have almost always a certain degree of confidence, because we know that there's going to be some movement around that. Part of this relates to, going back to this picture over here, this is a long-lived product, all right? We're going to be making some mistakes along the way that we know that we're going to have to redo. It's never going to be finished. It's not meant to be finished, all right? So there's a certain element of recognizing the messiness of the process and trying to look at communicating that messiness more clearly with percentage confidence, and to more clearly articulate, okay, these are things that should be done in advance of something making its way into the heart of the product. Does that kind of help? All right. You had a question or comment from before? Good. Yes?
So I think what you're saying is that this level of requirement, it's a very macro thing. You're not talking about, very detailed requirements, detailed specs. This is the process of getting an agreement with the business to actually make an investment.
Correct. That's right. Requirements are an investment decision.
You can then kick into the classic agile process with the backlog and all that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. So I'd say that if we connect back to what you were saying about the agile, the regular agile process, that part of this, at least in Scrum terms, that has been allocated to the product owner role, it gives a little bit more clarity as to what needs to be done in an element of product owner before something is making its way into the backlog. And that's one of the things that I've always found sorely lacking in Scrum. It's the assumption that things will just make their way in there properly. And in my experience, again, many product owners were glorified business analysts that were not necessarily people that had enough of a backbone to stand up to the rest of the business organization. And in some cases, they, even if they did not have, let's call it the rigor. So even if they were someone of stature in the business, they didn't have the rigor around the business analysis, the architecture, the project management, in order to say, well, how do we turn this into a schedule? They just sort of said, this needs to be done by the end of the year, this needs to be done by the end of the first quarter, and the team just sort of accepted that and ran with it. So even if they had the backbone, they didn't necessarily have the tools to turn that into meaningful activity that they would do with the rest of the business organization and how they interacted with the team. So that's what this is trying to solve. Not necessarily to replace Agile or to say that, that there isn't a product owner. Okay? I saw another hand? Yes. Mm. Right. Mm-hmm. So do I have any experience on organizations working on a no estimate model? We're kind of trying to do that in my organization. However, the important thing about any type of no methodology is not what it's saying no to, it's what it's saying yes to in its place. All right? So whether that's no SQL or no estimates or no managers or whatever it is, it's you don't just take something out. You need to look at why that thing existed to begin with and find additional tools, processes, frameworks, whatever, to do that in its stead. Can it work? Yes. In practice, there is still, let's call it relative sizing. So there's a certain element of saying, this is going to take much longer than that. Regardless of a detailed estimate, there still is an element of saying, well, what is the value of a thing versus what is the cost of a thing that needs to make its way into the investment decision of what are we going to work on. Another important element is this thing needs to be preserved. In other words, not doing that sort of multitasking the team to death. Regardless of no estimates or yes estimates, people that are working on a bunch of stuff in parallel that are at the same time as they're building new features, they're having to support the old thing, and that is hard. How do you create an organization that can navigate that effectively? So by saying, well, people already have to do that, therefore estimates can't be enforced in the sense of the team is working on other things, then what's left is, as you were describing in the no estimate movement, is you trust people to do what needs to be done. The problem with that is scope creep. Is what needs to be done this big, or that big? And it's very easy to fall into the trap of just one more thing. So I'd say that the most important thing that we've discovered internally is just how rigorous we need to be around scoping of the thing. And to say, deliver the smallest thing possible before doing anything else. And then the next incremental unit needs to be examined independently of that. So again, I'd be concerned about that the organizations that are saying, we're after doing Agile, now we're doing no estimates, that what works well, you take a small group of highly skilled people working in a domain that they understand well in a business domain that is already largely successful for any number of reasons. It's kind of like Facebook tripped over social networking and got it right. And then that rocket ship started taking off and they started getting money thrown at them. It's very freeing to have hundreds of millions of dollars available to you without having to worry about making payroll at the end of every month. It's very easy to say no estimates when you don't have to worry about payroll. When you have to worry about delivering something to a customer by a certain date, otherwise they won't pay, it's much more difficult. So there are a whole number of things. It's very easy to say, but Facebook, but Twitter, but Uber, but some, look at them, isn't it awesome? And to take practices that work well in that context and try to put them as an implant in a totally different context, and then to see those things fail. So I think it's those things don't get acknowledged enough in any of the process discussions that happen, is what are the surrounding elements that enable or hurt a given practice. So again, I believe that there is value in no estimates as a theory, but it requires a much higher level of maturity of the organization.